So I wanted to make another video about world building. Those don't tend to do that well for me, but I enjoy making them. Also with this newfound audience, maybe some of you will find them interesting. So what I wanted to talk about to you today is how belief influence behavior. When we craft worlds, we often find ourselves designing religion, philosophy, and ideology. And as world builder, we often spend a lot of time thinking about how the world is, and maybe not quite enough thinking about how the people think the world is. But the latter has much more influence on people's behavior. The gap between reality and the average person conceptualization of reality can be more or less wide depending on the society you depict, and this gap can be a very fun place to explore. Present your player with the world as most people believe it is, and through their adventuring, have them realize that the world might not be as their character thought it was. We have to be careful though, when we design belief system, I often see them being just made as a cool idea without any effort being put behind it, without really thinking of the implication that such belief system would have. I'd like to give some example on how different belief systems impact the way people behave and the society that results from them. Before going further, I need to make some disclaimer. I'm going to use some real world example. Those are going to be very oversimplified for brevity's sakes. And every one of those examples could feel like an hour long this lecture on their own. I'm just using them as like point of reference that we can share and to get you think a little deeper about your fantasy world design. Speaking of which, I often say that if you don't want to spend so much time on your world design, if you like a game where you just like kick down the door of the dungeon and kill everyone there, that's fine. Or if you enjoy a Gonzo type game where anything goes and it's all very surreal, that's also good. But this video might not be so useful to you, and then might be too much into the weeds. And this advice I'm gonna give here is more useful if you like to do a lot of intrigue, or if you like to do horror, like cosmic horror. I often say that seeing the world as it is, without the veil of propaganda, is like gazing onto a great Tulu. Finally, I'm a Christian and a Catholic, so I'm going to be biased, take that into consideration when I provide example and my interpretation of the world. I too see the world through the lens of my belief. Nobody's immune to it. So let's start with some impact that Christianity had on the West since I'm on the subject. I assume that most of my audience comes from what we used to call Christendom, and I assume that not everybody of you consider himself a Christian, but regardless, the impact that Christianity had on the West and on the world is undeniable. A big one that is directly related to this hobby we like to engage in, of tabletop RPG, is in storytelling. Yes, the story of Christ changed the way we tell story quite a bit. Before Christ, the notion of the noble hero sacrificing himself was very rare. Heroes back in the days were mostly jerks, powerful individuals, imposing their will on the world and on people around them. The idea that the powerful should serve and protect the weak really spread out with Christian belief. Ultimately, this is what gave rise to the whole notion of chivalry and the noble knight. We can see the contrast with samurais in Japan. There was no such conception. The samurai were a class apart and had complete disregard for the commoner. If you want your world to have this notion of chivalry and noblesse oblige, it might be interesting to consider where does it come from, because it is a bit of a weird idea. It doesn't appear weird to us because we have been so baited in it for so long, but when it was first introduced to powerful people, it was a laughable concept. The idea of the noble knight, defender of the poor and the oppressed, is also directly linked to what we usually conceive paladins to be. If your world doesn't have such a concept, what do you do with your paladins? And what about the economic implication of this doctrine? In a society where you don't have the concept of serving and protecting the people below you, what is to stop the powerful as seeing the weak as just a resource to exploit? And if this is the relationship that exists between what is basically the warrior class and the peasant class, what is the incentive to the laborer to actually produce more? This can quickly lock your society at a subsistence level, because the strong are taking just as much as they want from the weak, leaving those last ones just enough so they can survive to produce more in the future. and the weak will produce just enough to survive and just enough just enough extra to give an incentive to the strong not to outright kill them. And of course, you can get this idea of fairness and of avoiding the systematic exploitation of the weak coming from different sources. It's not unique to Christianity, but it's also far from being a universal concept. And in the West, it was vastly spread by Christianity, and there are still places in the world today which doesn't get that idea at all. Another Christian concept that has been a big boon to the prosperity of our societies is the idea of turn the other cheek. And I know this is an idea that many non-Christians find hard to accept or understand, and even many Christians do. It does sound very cocky and weak, and even for me, this was a big hold up for a long time until I realized the consequence of the alternative. If you don't have such a concept, you get into a society of offense and revenge. Somebody does you wrong, and you have to get satisfaction. You have to get revenge, but there's always a situation where the guy who offended you won't recognize that he did anything wrong. Maybe it was an accident, or maybe you're just making stuff up. And now you taking revenge on him is an unprovoked offense. And now he needs to take revenge on you. But now this revenge is a new affront for you. And you get into this cycle of offense and revenge that put you into generational feuds. Those feuds are very destructive, and it's an absolutely waste of resource. It really hinder the prosperity of a society. The ancient Scandinavian people had this problem, and so did the Arab world. Just this concept of forgiving an offense to avoid, it does avoid a lot of those issues. Of course, we have to remember that we only have two cheeks, so we don't let people endlessly abuse us. But this forgiving the first offense is very helpful for the development of society. It's also something that can be explored in your setting. Maybe there's a shift in perception in the population in one direction or the other. When it comes to religion, my fantasy world, I like to keep a level of uncertainty. The people believing can be absolutely convinced of their belief, but I don't like having the gods walking around themselves or in avatar form. Or if they do, let's make it not so obvious so there can be debate about it. If you have certainty about the existence of God or gods, there's no more place for faith. And if your god or your gods expect people to live by a certain standard for a posthumous reward or punishment, like hell or heaven, the confirmation of their existence changed the equation quite a bit. It stepped on a people's free will, and because it's like if I'm asking you to do something with a gun to your head, you could choose not to do it and get shot, but if you do as I ask, you're not exactly acting freely. The threat is too real and too the direct. And while we're on the subject of the afterlife, this is also a big one. This impact the way people act. If we compare the Viking conception with the Christian one, the first one believed that if you died in battle, you would have a chance to get to Valhalla, and that was the best you could hope for. So of course this impacted the way they behave and the way they comported themselves in battle. And their gods seem to care very little about what they did outside of that in their everyday life. The Christian had a very different view on the question, which what you would get you into heaven was your faith and your work. And yes, faith alone is a rather modern concept, mostly a Protestant one. But the idea that faith and work would get you to heaven did impact how people live their daily life quite a bit. Probably more than Norse faith influenced their daily life. Christianity, and especially like the traditional form of it, is a very demanding religion. We have rules to follow and sacrifices to make. And when we break the rules, we're all bound to do so, like quite often for most of us. We can try to make up for it a bit by a little more sacrifice. That's how we saw the construction of those magnificent cathedrals and the creation of those amazing pieces of art. And the way the Christian belief in the afterlife is set up can also greatly impact a person's of faith's attitude toward death. If you feel you're in a state of grace, your sin have been forgiven, and you're right with God, You can be quite bold while facing death. If you're not in a state of grace, it is quite a different story. Now you can have the fear of death get to you. This is a point you can play with in your setting, both with people of different culture, with different view on the afterlife, or with people of the same culture sharing the same view on the afterlife, but with different evaluation of how they live their life and where they'll end up after death. If you have a religion with a system of confession and forgiveness of sin, like we Catholics do, you could even have like the same character see his attitude change after a confession, suddenly becoming much more bold and ready to face death. It wasn't uncommon for people to go to confession before battle or before a duel. And if you have a cleric in your party, maybe that's a function he could serve. You know, this could be like an interesting encounter. The party may meet a group of enemies, and those enemies don't want to fight at all. But then they meet again a little later, and all of a sudden they're all emboldened, or maybe they run away, and a couple of hours later, they go looking for the party, and they come back, and now they're ready to fight to the death because they got this confession. This can just add a whole layer of texture to your world. Now it's not so much just a one-dimensional set for the characters to go and just kill monster. And I talked a lot about religion, but belief doesn't end there. We are now living in an age that is not religious in the traditional sense of the term, but all our decisions are still driven by beliefs over reality. I'm not gonna use examples that can be more controversial as they are closer to our lived experience. If you are offended by what I'm saying here, please feel free to use the dislike button and to yell at me in the insult section below. This is why YouTube have those features, so I hope they make you feel better. Although traditional organized religion are often seen as a relic of the past and human beings are still very religious, it is in our nature. They just realign their system of belief to something else, but it is exactly the same mechanism. Now the priests have just been replaced by celebrities repeating a message that is fed up to them by their owner, and people have repeated mindlessly the mantra of trust the science for the better part of 3 years now, and they have acted in a way that have absolutely nothing to do with science. I have to be careful about what I say here, as I could be found guilty of spreading around heresy, and YouTube could terminate my account, which is another sign of this whole thing is much more religious than science. And it's the same with global warming. Sorry, with climate change now, because it can never be disproven. But billions of dollars are spent to fight this big evil of the temperature getting a few degrees warmer. And if you question the narrative, you'll be shut out of polite society. And there's so much more. People now believe that men can become women and vice versa, and we all have to pretend that this is a thing. And we allow men to fight in a MMA arena against women with disastrous consequences. Or we like to pretend that everybody are the same, regardless of race and gender. So now we have to explain why those different groups have different level of success in society. But we are all blinded by our belief, and we will come with all kind of like silly explanation that don't hold the water, rather to re-examine our assumption. And this is not limited to liberals. They are easy to point and laugh at, but you could look at the other thing, like the belief that 6 million Jews have been killed in World War II. It doesn't matter if it didn't happen. If you believe it did and act accordingly, it is as real as it needs to be. It is already controlling your behaviors. And it is not just something that only affects society at large. Even personal belief will affect your behavior. Is eating animal wrong? Clearly, it's not bad for you. People have been doing it forever. But some people will still avoid doing it and jeopardize their health due to personal belief. And yeah, if they're vegan watching, I'm sure they're gonna cry and no, it's actually much better for you. But that's just scope. We can all see the result. And I am too influenced by my belief. I believe that our society is controlled by satanic evil people, rotten to the core. I didn't get any vaccine because I was convinced that the people behind them were Luciferians. And when the FTX crypto exchange became a thing, I stayed away because I thought the guy behind it was Luciferian, and it served me well so far, but this is still my belief dictating my behaviors. So, what I'm saying is that even if you don't want to make religion a big thing in your setting, or if you are in a setting that is more modern, or even science fiction, it doesn't make people rational. And if you want your people to act like people, you should consider their conception of reality and their belief system. If you want to throw a curveball at your player, playing with the gaps between what the people of the setting believe and what reality actually is can be very interesting. When you present your world to the player in session 0, explain it to them as their character perceives it and let them discover the way in which reality differs through their adventuring. Avoid the big exposition dump. Not only is that bad game mastering, but it also ruins the mystery and the surprise. And I went through many different examples in this video that is way too long. Maybe I just felt like taking shot at different people. And I'm not saying you should consider all those things when designing your world. Game world must still be abstracted to some extent or they become unwieldy. But you should consider some of those aspects and have some fun with those gaps between reality and the conceptualization of reality by your NPCs. Bring your player on a journey of discovery that is wider than just going to a new place. Have them discover truth about the world that most NPC are unaware of. And let's see how they will deal with the NPC thereafter. Or send your player to a new continent with new people that hold nonsensical belief. Just think if you were someone from the 50s arriving in 2023, and yes, the technology would blow your mind, but think about how it would be when they would explain all to you all the modern progressive ideology. You would think that the world went insane, and you would be right. But a huge proportion of the population nowadays honestly believe that crap. And yeah, it might not be as big as what the media want you to believe, but it would be more in a couple of years. I wouldn't recommend making the people as crazy as the 2023 shit libs. It would break immersion as to be unbelievable because people cannot maintain a society, a civilization while being that insane, and that's why we are losing ours. Now we're only going on with the momentum we created in the past. In fact, that's something that could be interesting in a game. Imagine if the PC making their way to a civilization that used to be great, but now the people lost their mind and the whole thing is collapsing. That can be a whole adventure right there. The PC investigate and figure out that this one great society has been infiltrated and taken over by an ancient evil that poisoned the mind of its people. You see, just considering those things gives you seeds of adventure that are different than just kicking down the door of a dungeon and kill the monster there, or just oh, a dragon moved in outside the town. So that's all about I had to say on this topic, more than I wanted to say really. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. God bless you and take care.